All right. So I want to talk a little bit more. We covered last week the passing of the quote Inflation Reduction Act, and there's been some further details that have come out that sort of speak to the process by which that bill was crafted. So I want to show you guys a clip here. This is David Sirota of The Lever. He went on Breaking Points, and I thought gave a very good breakdown I'm sorry, just a second here. I got to figure out how I'm sharing this. A breakdown of the process that this, the negotiation process of this bill. Okay. Anyway, David Sirota on Breaking Points. This was a conversation he had with Krystal, and I thought it went into these details and covered things quite nicely. So we'll watch this, come back, and discuss.
Time now for our weekly partnership segment with our friends over at The Lever. And joining us this week is the man himself, David Sirota. Great to see you, David.
Good to see you, too.
So you have a look this week at the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed into law by Joe Biden this week. And let's go ahead and put your tear sheet up on the screen here. You're focused in particular on some of the major blatant Wall Street giveaways that ended up in the final package. You say the Wall Street vote that screamed the quiet part out loud. Senators gave their Wall Street donors another gift after blocking the expanded child tax credit. Before we dig into the specifics of Ms. Sinema and her allies here, though, I would love for you, David, because we haven't heard your view on the show yet, just to give your overall view of this package and, the end result and whether it was worth voting for in your estimation.
I think it's hard to know whether this bill will do more good than harm. I think if you force me to answer whether it does, I guess there's a decent chance that this bill marginally improves the climate situation, marginally reduces emissions. It was sold as a bill to reduce 40% of emissions. That's not actually what it does. It adds at best another 10% of emissions reductions. The current policy gets about 30% of emissions reductions according to the same estimates. So a marginal reduction in emissions if everything goes right, and that's the big if. When making a climate bill, attaching to a climate bill a vast expansion of fossil fuel development, you are inherently creating a gamble on the climate. You are putting good investments into renewable energy, but then tying those investments effectively to a potential expansion of oil and gas leasing in the future. And so you that's a huge roll of the dice. Yes, maybe the renewable energy stuff takes and outpaces the fossil fuel development. That's a win for the climate. An alternate scenario is the renewable energy stuff doesn't take. The oil and gas industry exploits the new leases, the expansion of leases in this bill, and that's not a win for the climate. So I think what happened here was the Democratic Party decided to cut a big giant check to every part of the energy economy because they didn't want to make a choice. They didn't want to create an enemy out of the oil industry. This is why the oil industry celebrated the passage of the bill. And that was their political formula. But science is telling us we need to stop all new fossil fuel development if we have a chance to really deal with the climate stuff, the climate crisis. So to my mind, again, a big gamble. Now, on the other side of this, the sort of social policy side of this, I think there was great investments in IRS enforcement that were long overdue. I think they unfortunately very seriously watered down the Medicare prescription drug pricing stuff. There's still a couple of good things in there, but they seriously watered it down. And then they included some real tax giveaways to Wall Street in this bill.
Well, and that's a great transition because you can see the fingerprints of corporate America on every single piece of this legislation. I agree with you on balance. I think it was better than doing nothing. I think it's a marginal benefit. And so, I don't want to say otherwise, but you see it certainly in the approach to climate. You see it in the approach to healthcare, which ends up getting watered down. And then you see it in these tax provisions. So let's talk about that piece because this was extremely blatant and you picked up on a real asymmetry here. So when Senator Sanders was saying, hey guys, all 50 of you claim to be in support of a child tax credit, why don't we add that to the bill? He was voted down. I think this is one of the ones where he was voted down 99-1 on something that they allegedly all care about. And the argument from Senator Sherrod Brown, supposedly a progressive, and others was, Bernie, we have to stay unified. This will, for some reason, tank the bill, so we can't vote with you on these things. However, when it came to Kyrsten Sinema and her being like, no, we can't close the carried interest loophole, and actually I want these other giveaways for Wall Street put into the bill, then they were willing to get on board and go along with that. Break down how all of that went down for us, David.
Sure. So the Democratic leadership, as you said, enforced party unity against Bernie Sanders' series of amendments that were designed to add back into the bill Democratic Party priorities. One of the big ones was the expanded child tax credit. He put an amendment on the floor. The Democratic leadership, the Democratic senators joined with the Republicans to vote that down. And as you said, the Democratic leadership said we have to preserve the integrity of this fragile deal. This legislation represents a very fragile deal. And even though we may supposedly want to do this good thing, reinstate the expanded child tax credit, we can't do that because we have to preserve this fragile balance. They voted that down, and then a few hours later, they joined with Sinema and Republicans to add into the bill, and I should mention, it wasn't all the Democrats, it was 7 Democrats, so party unity not enforced. 7 Democrats joined with the Republicans to add into the bill a $35 billion tax break for the private equity industry. It basically said that the private equity industry, in facing the new corporate minimum tax, doesn't have to effectively tally the revenues of its portfolio companies in deciding or in terms of whether it qualifies and faces that tax. So basically, it creates a special carve out for the private equity industry that has dumped $250 million of campaign contributions into the federal political process in the last 2 election cycles. So a blatant and naked giveaway to the donor class hours after the same Senate voted down an expansion of the wildly popular child tax credit.
And Kyrsten Sinema obviously sort of led the charge on this. I mean, how much money has she personally gotten from private equity? I know oftentimes the media likes to paint her and Joe Manchin as like acting in their state's best interest, and that's what they really care about. Arizona not known as like a hotbed of private equity activity here. So she's just, I rarely do you see such a blatant quid pro quo, even though they're there all the time, as was on evidence here. Larry Summers even was like, wow, this is gross even by my standards.
Yes. I mean, look, Sinema, the Associated Press reported about $1 million of campaign contributions from the private equity industry flowed into her campaign in the lead up to this, into the lead up of the negotiations over this bill. Sinema obviously working for her private equity donors. There's just really no pretense here. By the way, there's no pretense with Joe Manchin either, the top recipient of oil and gas money, adding in the oil and gas giveaways in this bill. I mean, one thing we can say is we are living in an era where the corrupt folks in Washington have stopped really trying to pretend like they're not corrupt, right? I mean, it's just out in the open. And in some ways that makes it easier to report on. It's easier to see. But I think what it's kind of an admission of is that corruption is now so normalized, so accepted, so part of the process out in the open that these legislators don't even feel a deterrent in terms of the optics of it. They are just doing the bidding of their donors. There's no other way to put it.
It's literally shameless. Like they literally can't be shamed.
Have no shame. They cannot be shamed.
Do not care. The thing that, to me, I mean, listen, I guess encouraged that something got through, right? And I think all the histrionics are historic and it's landmark and whatever is obviously dramatically overstated, but it was encouraging that something happened. However, on the other hand, I look at it, and because it is so clear how it was curtailed at every turn and watered down at every turn by corporate America, it also really demonstrates how constrained our political system is as long as big money is so dominant. Like, you may want Medicare to negotiate on prescription drug prices, but they're like, yeah, well, maybe we'll give you a few drugs, maybe a few years down the road. You may want Medicare for all, but they're like, how about we just keep some little bit of extra Affordable Care Act subsidies in here? It's all what corporate America is willing to tolerate, to, all the way to the point of the oil and gas companies they were cool with this bill. They were celebrating it. So what does it say at a larger scale about what is possible in our politics with our current political system?
you are touching on such an important point here, which is that I think this bill is another example of the political paradigm of the best that you can hope for in our current politics are policies that do not make a choice. Now, the good side of that, the best side of that is you can get good things funded, right? You can get investments, for instance, in renewable energy, things that do not have a natural opposition. You can get those things funded. But the cost of getting those things funded is to give giveaways to the industries creating the problem. So this bill did not have an organized opposition because the oil industry got huge gifts in this bill. Now, you can say that that's a good short-term politics, but I would argue if the oil and gas companies are happy about a bill, then it is not a bill that is seriously taking on the climate crisis. I would argue to you that if the health insurance companies are happy about a health care bill, then you are not fundamentally taking on the problem in the healthcare economy. And on the list goes. So I guess the point is that we are in a situation where neither party is willing to make any kind of choice that asks the powerful economic actors creating problems to sacrifice anything at all. And you cannot fundamentally and systemically solve those problems unless you challenge the interests creating those problems.
I think that is very well said and very important point for people to reflect on as this week comes to a close. David Sirota, great to see you. Thank you so much.
So I just thought that was a pretty good, nuanced take on the whole situation, right? They acknowledge, yes, it might have some marginally good things in it, but that is not nearly enough, and you cannot call it a climate bill if the fucking oil companies are supporting it, are happy about it. It's a joke. It's a joke, right? Anyway, David does great reporting. For those of you who are not familiar with his work, The Lever is his outlet. He and a number of fantastic reporters over there. Make sure that you go follow them. I use their work quite a bit, and David does a fantastic job of calling out the corruption in D.C. So the other angle that I wanted to bring up about this is here it is. Okay. The IRS receiving more funding, right? Now, David kind of mentioned it in that clip that one of the provisions in this bill is $80 billion going to the IRS for further enforcement. Now, there's a few things to say about this. The IRS historically has gone after poor and middle-class people because those people don't have the funds to bring on all the legal teams and all the legal battles. So it's much cheaper and easier to audit poor middle-class people than it is to audit the wealthy and corporations and, these conglomerates. So the IRS has long kind of said we need the resources to go after those big dogs. So, of course, you kind of find yourself in a conundrum here when you start talking about giving them any funding to do that, right? Because one can easily say, well, they need these resources to go after the wealthy, to have the resources to deal with the legal battles that the wealthy will put up. But then there's the easy retort of, but they historically have not gone after the wealthy, so why are we giving them more resources, right? The, of course, easy solution would have been to mandate in the bill exactly who these resources are supposed to go to auditing. But they didn't do that. They just threw $80 billion in resources to the IRS. So this has created all sorts of questions and controversy about how those resources will be utilized. And I want to show you guys a thread here, or a couple of tweets, to be totally fair, of the situation and what positives it might bring. She says, when the IRS was funded at the levels we're returning to, the rich were taxed more. Quote, millionaires were 80% less likely to be audited in 2018 than they were in 2011. Audits of millionaires recouped just $1.9 billion in 2018, down from $5.1 billion in 2010. She carries on here, I'm a little concerned about enforcement follow-through as well, but the best argument is when the IRS was better funded, the rich were taxed more. So that's just to give you that side of things. I also just want to be really clear. I actually meant to say this up front. Of course, we here at Real Progressives are very fervent in our framing things from an MMT perspective, and MMT teaches us that taxes do not actually fund spending. So a lot of the controversy surrounding the IRS, the increase in funds for the IRS, is sort of, framed disingenuously or deceitfully, where people are saying we need that money to pay for things, so we need to go audit the wealthy so that we can bring in more taxes. That part is utter nonsense and is harmful framing, and I just want to put that out front. But we also, as progressives, as leftists, very much believe in increasing taxes on the wealthy who have gotten away with taking over our society. So you tax the wealthy to try to decrease their power and decrease the inequity in our society, among a whole nother, number of other reasons. But there's Brianna making the case that it is literally true that when the IRS had more funding, they did go after the wealthy more than they do now. But I think it's fair to question, based upon the trends over recent decades, what the IRS will do with this increase in funding. I wish it would have just been mandated in the bill. It would have been very easy to do, but they negated to do that. So, we'll cover going forward what ends up happening. I'm sure there will be reporting on where those funds are directed. But the other angles were they were going to potentially go after like servers for tips and shit like that, or people for Venmo transactions or these kinds of things. And I think that would be very harmful and unnecessary. But my position on increasing resources for the IRS will obviously be solely determined based upon what those resources actually go to. And at this point, it's a little bit hard to tell what they're actually going to do with it. So I hope that they use it to go after corporations and the wealthy, which they have long claimed they don't have the resources to do. I am not naive enough to expect them to, but we will keep up on that story going forward as well. So, and once again, you guys, taxes do not fund spending. Get that idea out of your fucking heads. realprogressives.org for all sorts of great content on MMT. If you do not know the basics of MMT, please do go to realprogressives.org and educate yourself on macroeconomics and why it's important to understand how federal finance functions. Also, The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton is a wonderful primer if you have not read it. Just wanted to put those plugs in really quick.